The man in the cab of the 30-ton excavator read one sheet of paper, and I watched the color drain out of his face like somebody had pulled a plug. He looked at the page, and he looked at me, and he looked at the woman standing on the gravel in white sneakers. And then he reached up and killed the diesel. It just stopped. In the quiet that dropped over the yard, you could hear the hydraulics tick as they cooled, and you could hear Paige Ostrin's voice climb half an octave as she asked him what in God's name he thought he was doing. And you could hear, if you knew how to listen for it, the sound of a homeowners association walking off the edge of a cliff it had spent 2 years building. She didn't know that last part yet. Neither did the operator, but I did, because I was the one who had handed him the page, and I knew exactly what was printed on it. Let me back up 11 days, because that's where this actually starts. My name is Grady Vaughn. I'm 49 years old. I've held a general contractor's license in this state for 22 of those years. And before that, I spent 9 years as a county building inspector, which is a polite way of saying I got paid to tell people their work wasn't good enough, and to write down precisely why. That job leaves marks on a man. I keep a permit for everything. I photograph everything. There's a filing cabinet in my workshop that my wife calls the shrine. 4 drawers of manila folders, one for every nail I have ever driven into my own property. And for most of my adult life, that habit made me look like a paranoid crank at dinner parties. For 11 days this spring, it made me look like a prophet. The workshop is what all of this is about, so you should understand what it was. 2 years ago, I built a detached shop out past the back of the house on our 1.5 acres in Stonewick Ranch, out in Talon County, where the live oaks run down to a dry creek, and every deed in the subdivision carries the same set of restrictions. 1,200 square feet, slab on grade, standing seam roof, a lift bay for the truck, and a wood shop for the work I do on weekends now that I mostly manage jobs instead of swinging the hammer myself. It cost me $200,000, and I did not spend $200,000 on a hope and a handshake. I went to the Architectural Review Committee first, submitted a full set of plans, elevations, a site survey, the whole package, and I waited the way you're supposed to wait. 6 weeks later, I got a letter back on association letterhead, signed by Merle Dawes, who chaired the committee then. Approved as submitted. No conditions. I had that letter framed and hung it on the shop wall over the workbench, partly out of pride, and partly because I'm the kind of man who frames a thing like that. Then I pulled a county building permit, passed my footing inspection, my framing inspection, and my final, and I filed every green tag in the shrine. I mention the framed letter because it matters later. Remember it. 2 years is long enough for a homeowners association to hold an election, and Stonewick's turned over the whole board on a single slate. Merle was gone. In came Paige Ostrand as president, 44, brand new to the neighborhood and brand new to the idea that she now ran it. Along with a lawyer named Kessler, the board kept on a small monthly retainer to make its letters sound like thunder. The first I heard of any of them was the certified envelope that landed in my box 11 days before the excavator showed up. Notice of violation. The detached accessory structure on my lot, it said, had been approved in error by a prior committee, was non-conforming under the covenants, and had to be removed within 10 days or the association would remove it and lien the property for the cost. Approved in error. I read that line 3 times. A homeowners association was telling me, in writing, that its own written approval didn't count because it had changed its mind about who I was allowed to be. I did the boring thing first, because the boring thing is usually the strong thing. I made copies of the framed letter, the county permit, and all 3 inspection tags, and I sent them to the board by certified mail, with a short note pointing out that the structure was approved, permitted, inspected, and lawful, and that I expected the notice to be withdrawn. I figured that was the end of it. That's the part I'm not proud of, thinking it would be that easy. What came back instead was a formal resolution of the board declaring my shop an architectural nonconformance, threatening a fine of $100 a day until it was gone, and a cease and desist from Kessler, telling me to stop, in his words, obstructing the association's lawful maintenance of community standards. But there was a line buried in the resolution that didn't fit, and my old inspector's eye snagged on it the way it snags on a floor joist that's a half-inch shy. The board recited that removal was necessary for consistency with pending enforcement matters. Pending enforcement matters. My shop had been standing quietly in my own backyard for 2 years. It wasn't pending anything. So why did tearing it down have anything to do with some other case? I'm a curious man by trade. You don't spend 9 years reading other people's plans without learning how to read between the lines of a bureaucracy. So I started pulling records. And because architectural applications in Stonewick are association documents that any owner can request, I got the committee log for the last 18 months. And there it was, plain as a stud in an open wall. 4 months earlier, a homeowner named Tom Beckett, whose lot backs up to mine across the creek, had submitted an application for a detached workshop. Nearly identical to mine. Same footprint, same roofline, same use. The committee, now chaired under Page's board, had rejected it flat. And Beckett hadn't taken it lying down. He'd filed a formal complaint against the association for selective enforcement, arguing they'd approved one man's shop and denied his for no reason anyone could name. That was the whole thing, right there. My shop wasn't the target. My shop was the evidence. As long as it stood in my backyard, approved and permitted and lawful, it was living proof that the association enforced its rules however it felt like on any given morning, which is exactly what Beckett needed to win. If they could make my building disappear, they could stand in front of a hearing and say there was no comparable approval, and Beckett's case would fall apart. I found out later there was a personal edge to it too, that Page's own husband, Rob, had wanted to build a shop and gotten steered away from even applying, and that the whole thing had curdled into a grudge dressed up as governance. But the machine of it was simple and cold. They needed to erase a witness, and the witness was made of concrete and steel and sat on my land. Once I understood that, I understood something worse, and it's the thing that told me how far they were willing to go. I made a couple of quiet calls to owners who'd been at the last board meeting, and one of them told me Page had said, when someone worried about the legality of tearing down a permitted structure, that a scratch was cheaper than a precedent. She meant it would be cheaper for the association to knock a corner off my building and pay a fine than to let it stand and lose Beckett's case. She was planning to break the law on purpose because she'd done the math and decided the law was a line item. That was the day this stopped being a paperwork dispute for me and became something I intended to win all the way down to the studs. So when the 10th day passed and the 11th morning came and I heard the lowboy trailer downshifting on the county road at 7, I was ready. I was standing at the property line in my work boots with my phone in my hand, and I did not do the thing every part of me wanted to do, which was plant myself in the dirt in front of the bucket and dare them. I've learned that the man who throws the first punch, or the first body, hands the other man the whole case. Paige came up the gravel in those white sneakers with the final notice in her fist, and she told me to my face that the association had every right to abate a non-conforming structure, and that if I interfered, she'd have me removed. I said good morning and kept my mouth shut on everything I couldn't read out loud later in a room full of witnesses. Behind me, my shop camera, the little weatherproof one I'd mounted over the shop door 2 years back and long since forgotten, was recording all of it. I wasn't standing in the dirt because I was somewhere better. I was on the phone with the district clerk's office, and my attorney was 2 miles away in the courthouse doing the only thing that actually mattered that morning, which was walking a temporary restraining order in front of a judge. We'd filed the day before. The application laid out the approval, the permit, the inspections, and the plain fact that you cannot let someone bulldoze a $200,000 permitted building over a boundary dispute and then argue about it afterward, because you can't unring that bell. Irreparable harm, the lawyers call it. At 7:41, my phone buzzed. The judge had signed. At 7:53, a Talon County Sheriff's deputy rolled up the gravel with the order on the seat beside him, because a TRO isn't worth the paper until somebody with a badge hands it across. That's the page the operator read. That's the moment I opened with. He took it and he read it, and the diesel died, and Paige Ostrin stood there in the sudden quiet, insisting the board had authority the judge had just told her, in writing, that she did not have. The bucket had been swinging down toward the northeast corner of my slab when the deputy pulled in. And here's the thing about a 30-ton machine and a startled operator. When he jerked to stop and reverse, the tip of the bucket dragged across the corner of my slab and took a fist-sized bite out of the concrete before it lifted away. A little puff of gray dust. Barely a scratch. My camera got it. Every frame. The bucket moving after the deputy was already on the property with the order in his hand. They just handed me the second half of my case, and they hadn't even felt the bump. I want to tell you the TRO ended it, but a restraining order is a pause button, not a verdict, and Paige wasn't a woman who took a pause button as an answer. Within a week, the board voted an emergency work order for a second attempt and started stacking daily fines, and Kessler sent a letter threatening to lien my home for the accumulating penalties. They were going to grind me down with money and process and try again the moment the order lapsed. So I stopped playing defense and reached for the thing they'd forgotten was even there. That shop was financed. I'd built it on a home improvement loan from Brazos Valley Bank, and the bank had recorded a deed of trust against the property, which means a national lender held a secured interest in the exact structure the association was trying to reduce to rubble. You do not get to destroy a bank's collateral to win a neighborhood argument. I wrote the bank's default and litigation department a letter, attached the notice, the resolution, and the emergency work order, and explained in plain English that the homeowners association intended to demolish improved property securing an active loan. I did not have to say the words tortious interference. Their lawyers knew them by heart. 4 days later, the association's mailbox received a cease and desist of its own. This one on the letterhead of a bank with a legal budget the size of Talon County's road fund, informing the board that any impairment of the bank's collateral would be met with immediate suit against the association and its directors individually. Suddenly, Paige wasn't swinging a bucket at one stubborn contractor. She was swinging it at a lender that eats homeowners associations for breakfast and flosses with the bylaws. Kessler, the board's thunder letter lawyer, went quiet. Then he sent the board a short, careful note recommending they obtain separate counsel, which is what a lawyer writes when he wants it on record that he warned them before he climbed out the window. And that crack in their wall let the light in on the thing that finished them. Because when I went digging into how this board had the authority to vote any of this, I found out it didn't. Tom Beckett and I sat down with the association's own records, the meeting minutes, and the notices of the last annual meeting, and we read them the way I read a set of plans, line by line, looking for the thing that isn't to code. The last election, the one that swept in Paige's slate, had never been properly noticed to the membership. The covenants required written notice a set number of days out. It hadn't gone. The quorum recorded in the minutes didn't match the sign-in sheet, which somebody had helpfully left in the same file. And Paige's own term, under the bylaws, had actually run out weeks before the board ever voted the resolution against my shop. The people who signed the order to demolish my building weren't a lawfully seated board at all. They were a handful of neighbors who had been acting like one. That distinction is the whole ballgame, and here's why. A director who acts within a validly constituted board is generally shielded. The association is the thing on the hook, and the association hides behind its treasury and its insurance. But directors acting outside their authority, ultra-virus, an invalidly seated board voting to destroy a permitted structure, aren't acting as the association. They're acting as themselves, as private people. And private people pay out of their own pockets. I kept that quiet. I kept the camera footage of the bucket moving after service quiet too. You don't show a man every card while you're still dealing. The covenants, it turned out, had one more feature the board loved right up until it didn't. Every dispute under the Stonewick Declaration went to binding arbitration, a private hearing in a conference room instead of an open courtroom. The board's new lawyer told them arbitration was friendlier, quieter, out of the newspapers, and they agreed to it fast, thinking they were choosing home field. They weren't choosing home field. They were choosing a small, locked room with no exit, and I walked into it carrying everything. The arbitrator was a retired district judge who had spent 30 years listening to people explain why the rules didn't apply to them, and she had the flat, patient face of a woman who'd heard all of it twice. I put it in front of her one piece at a time. The framed approval letter, Merle Dawes' signature on association letterhead, approved as submitted, no conditions. Merle himself, who I'd asked to come not to switch sides, but simply to confirm that yes, that was his signature, and yes, he'd approved my plans as chairman. The county permit, and 3 inspection tags that took the words unsafe and non-conforming off the table entirely, because a building the county passed 3 times is neither. The recorded deed of trust and the bank's letter, showing the board had knowingly tried to destroy secured collateral. The footage of the bucket biting my slab after the deputy served the order, which is the difference between a mistake and contempt. And last, the minutes and the notices and the sign-in sheet, proving the people who ordered all of this had no authority to order anything. Then I said the one word the whole case had been built on from the beginning: estoppel. You cannot tell a man in writing to spend $200,000 building something, watch him spend it in reliance on your written word, and then 2 years later declare your own signature a mistake and send a machine to tear it down. The law does not let you have it both ways. Their signature bound them. It had bound them the entire time. The arbitrator's award ran to 11 pages, and I'll give you the short version. The demolition order was void. My approval was valid, binding, and enforceable, and the structure would stand. The resolution was punitive and had been issued without authority by an improperly seated board. And because the directors had acted ultra vires, outside the shield of the association, the arbitrator assigned the cost to them personally. My attorney's fees, the bank's costs, and one line item I'll remember for the rest of my life. The itemized repair of one fist-sized bite out of the northeast corner of my slab were to be paid by the individual directors out of their own pockets, not out of the association's reserves. Paige Ostrand had told a room full of neighbors that a scratch was cheaper than a precedent. It turned out to be the most expensive scratch in the history of Talon County, and she paid for it herself. There was one more thing, and it's the part I still think is funny in the dry way that things are funny when they land on the right person. In proving my approval was valid and enforceable, I'd proven the exact thing Tom Beckett needed. The whole reason they'd wanted my shop gone was to make the selective enforcement problem disappear. And instead, they'd stood in a locked room and put my approval into the record under oath. There was now no argument left. The association was directed to approve Beckett's identical application. Paige had set out to destroy one precedent, and by chasing it into a corner, she'd carved it in concrete for the entire street. I didn't take $1 past my costs. I didn't need to. My shop is still standing, the framed letter still hangs over the workbench, and I never did fix the corner of the slab myself. The directors paid for that. Last I heard, Tom Beckett poured his footing in the fall. On a clear day, I can see the standing seam roof of his shop go up across the creek, the twin of mine, built on the approval they spent 2 years and their own savings trying to erase. Here's what should keep you up at night if you ever sit on one of these boards. Everything that buried Paige Ostrand, she wrote herself. The approval letter, the resolution admitting the structure was approved in error, the emergency work order, the minutes that proved her own board was never lawfully seated. None of it came from Grady. It came from their own file cabinet. A homeowners association is a paper machine, and it runs on the assumption that nobody will ever read the paper back to it out loud. If you take one practical thing from this, take this. Written approval is a legal fact, not a mood. When a board signs off on a project you spend real money to build, that reliance is protected. The doctrine's called estoppel. Keep the letter. Keep the permit. Photograph the inspection tags. And know that the shield protecting board members evaporates the instant they act outside their authority. An invalid election isn't a technicality. It's the difference between the association paying and them paying. They never lost on the merits of my shop. They lost because they were so sure their say-so was the law that they never checked whether they were a real board. So here's my question. If a group of your neighbors voted to send a bulldozer to your backyard tomorrow, would you know how to find out whether they had the authority to vote at all? Or would you just move your truck? Tell me down below.